lady. It helps that we live next door to each other, so we share the same riot when that happens. Thanks everyone for coming to listen to this talk. If you are coming to class next week, you'll hear this all over again, so apologies in advance. You might want to leave right now if you don't want that to happen. Today's kind of an odd day to give this talk because I'm going to be saying something about the Ugandan Anti-Homosexuality Bill, which after a long and quite tortuous legislative career has made it back onto the order of, I forget the exact technical word, the order of papers on the agenda of the parliament yesterday or today. So it's suddenly become a live issue again with a very real possibility that it will be read and possibly even passed sometime in the next 2 weeks. So it feels like a really urgent moment somehow. My own research is, I'm not sure how closely connected to the fortunes of this bill, but I think there are some linkages, and I'm still trying to think through how relevant this work might be to the political and legal debate that is ongoing at the moment. I've sort of become really interested in geography and history, and I want to basically divide or talk about why geography and why history in this presentation. So perhaps, and therefore why we should be doing historical geography as a way of doing politics or law. I sort of became interested in geography because of the way we talk about places in debates about sexuality. And I first noticed some of this in the debate in India over Section 377 of the Indian Penal Code, which criminalizes sodomy, well, criminalizes carnal intercourse against the order of nature, whatever that is. Typically interpreted as sodomy between two consenting male adults, two male adults, or two male sexed beings. I'm quite unclear what the original legislative intent was. But one of the interesting features of this debate between activists, sexual minority activists, and the terminology is really complicated, so perhaps we can spend some time thinking about whether we call them LGBT, queer, sexual minority. I want to bracket those questions for a moment. So one of the interesting features of the conversation between activists and conservatives in the state was, on the one hand, you had conservatives arguing that homosexuality was a Western import, culturally inauthentic, alien, etc. And on the other hand, you had the state arguing that, sorry, I said that wrong. Conservatives and the state arguing that homosexuality was the alien import. And on the other hand, you had activists saying it was homophobia that was the colonial import via the Indian Penal Code, which was a colonial imposed statute. And although these are politically opposed antagonistic positions, the shared premise was that anything that came from outside didn't belong within the territorial container of the post-colonial nation state. So there was almost a shared politics of nativism, except that the two sides disagreed over what came from outside, what was not native. This is, so maybe that's sort of one set of conversations to think about and bracket. Another set of conversations that we now think of and understand as the phenomenon of homo-nationalism, following Jaspir Puar's incredible work in terrorist assemblages and all of the critiques and reactions and further work that has spawned, which, for the purposes of this discussion, I will suggest we can understand as the phenomenon in which homosexual politics becomes co-opted into discourses of nationalism to serve various purposes. So that one of the things we're seeing at the moment is a kind of neo-Orientalist discourse in which LGBT rights become a new marker of modernity, distinguishing the civilized from the savage, a new way of marking an age-old distinction. And one of the things that I think is interesting or common about these different sets of conversations is a particular kind of geography in which particular places are marked as being spaces of homosexual/queer freedom, and other places are marked as being spaces of oppression or places of oppression. It's a fixed and absolutist geography in which the essence of belonging to particular places is somehow wrapped up in attitudes towards sexuality. so that how one speaks about how one does sexuality, how one performs it, is considered a marking of belonging or non-belonging to those particular places. And there's something quite, as many activists and scholars have pointed out, there is something incredibly disingenuous both analytically and normatively. Analytically disingenuous, normatively dangerous about this fixed and absolutist way of talking about place. And there's a whole literature about this that I won't fully go into, but I'm sure you can already guess the directions of those kinds of critiques. One line of critique is that while homosexual behavior, same-sex behavior, is observed across space and time and is in fact universal, even if homosexual identity, the notion that one has a sexuality, that one's sexuality says something about who one is, that is a culturally specific development, which Foucault locates in Europe in the 1860s and 70s as a result of the proliferation of discourses on medicine and law and psychiatry and so forth. But homosexual behavior is universal, and if that's the case, then the argument that same-sex behavior is foreign or inauthentic is disingenuous. And there's a lot of literature, mostly in the genres of history, anthropology, and perhaps literary studies, that tries to demonstrate this, this prevalence of behavior across space and time. But it's complicated by the work on identity, which locates that quite specifically in particular places and times, and then traces the diffusion of identity forms from those places to other places, which opens up arguments about cultural inauthenticity. There is work that is critical of Foucault from queer scholars, suggesting that identity isn't somehow born in Europe and diffuses outwards along vectors of capital or HIV/AIDS funding or all of the other vectors that are typically adduced as carriers of these identities. So Afsaneh Najmabadi says in the context of Iran that Foucault was wrong to think that identity was somehow born in 1870 in Europe. And that actually, if you look at pre-colonial Iran, you can find evidence of same-sex identities. What does mark the rupture in her reading of Foucault is not the fact of identity itself, but the fixity of identity. The notion that one had the same sexual identity throughout life, instead of transitioning from some identities to others at various points in life. The other problem, and the more obvious sort of moral normative problem with this kind of politics of essences, where one's attitude towards sexuality is seen as a marker of belonging to place, is that it polices people morally. It places some people inside and other people outside, and that has very dangerous and very obvious consequences for people's sense of belonging, for security, for how violence is distributed, how economic opportunity is distributed, and so forth. So one of the things I've been trying to think about is what happens, what are the alternatives for getting outside of these fixed and absolutist geographies? How else do we think about homosexuality, sexual identities, violence against those identities, homophobia, and so forth? And here I've been quite influenced by the work of David Harvey, who I think is wonderful for introducing geography to non-geographers and making us, alerting us to the ways in which we use notions of space and place without perhaps being rigorous enough about that. And in his book, Cosmopolitanism and the Geography of Freedom, Geographies of Freedom, actually, one of the things he does is he tries to push readers away from this absolutist sense of geography, the notion of places as blocks that are cut off from others. And the broad agenda of the book is to urge us to move away from, and I'm quoting here, from an Aristotelian conception of the world as composed of distinct and autonomous things, each with its own essence, to more dialectical and process-oriented philosophies that hold that things have no unchanging essence and do not exist outside the processes, flows, and relations that create, sustain, or undermine them. So it's a much more dialectical, transactional, process-oriented understanding of how places come to be, a vision in which places produce each other in interaction with each other. And so he's inviting us to think about places not as inert static objects, but as producing each other in conversation with each other. So the next step in my thinking is, how do we apply this? How do we think about the institutionalization of homophobia in particular places and times in this much more dialectical, process-oriented way? And one of the persons who does this, although not exactly in these geographical terms, but I think in a much more historical sense, but who does it very illuminatingly, is Afsaneh Najmabadi, who I mentioned earlier, in her work on Iran. A wonderful book called Women with Mustaches and Men Without Beards. It's an account, a gendered account of a gendered history of Iran. And a particularly significant moment of transition in this gendered history of Iran, the 19th century, when modernizing Iranian elites are coming into contact with European elites and beginning to reshape their society in all sorts of ways. Najmabadi locates or identifies a number of shifts or ruptures in Iranian society in this moment of contact. She points to various things like changes in representation from a period when beautiful men and women were portrayed in early Qajar painting as having very similar facial and bodily features, to much more sharply differentiated representations of beauty, when men and women were portrayed very differently towards the end of the 19th century. Also shifts in autobiographical writing from quite non-judgmental references to same-sex desire earlier on to much more judgmental references, much more moral policing and that sort of writing as well. And her broad argument is that as modernizing Iranian elites came in contact with Europeans and began to understand that polite European society considered same-sex relations to be a moral abomination, they, that is the Iranian elites engaged in these contacts, began to engage in various practices of dissimulation and disavowal. So various forms of embarrassed explanation that disavowed these representations of same-sex desire. So you would hear people saying, writing, explaining that, for example, Sufi poetry was meant to be read purely metaphorically, as metaphor or allegory that of the love that the devout had for the divine, and not meant to be read literally at all. Men seen holding hands in public spaces were explained away as instances of homosociality and not really evidence of homosexuality. Interestingly, one of the points she makes in the book is that early Iranian feminists who believed that transforming the lives of women required transforming marriage from a loveless procreative contract into a romantic, much more caring contract, required the stigmatization of other forms of desire. So the argument was, if our men stopped sleeping with boys, they would treat us as married women better. And so she says Iranian feminism carries what she calls the birthmark of the disavowal of other forms of desire in its early stages of self-articulation. And that's really interesting to me, because we tend to think that feminism and queer are necessary and inevitable allies. And I think that's a really interesting moment where they're not necessarily so. So what's really interesting for me about this account is this notion of encounter, that there is something about encounter between different places that produces this institutionalization of homophobia. Also, what's interesting about this explanation is the distribution of responsibility. She's not making a crude argument that says that Europeans straightforwardly impose homophobia or teach homophobia to Iranians. Instead, the argument is one about choices that Iranian elites are making when they encounter European modernity. It's about the choices, the ways in which they think Iranian society needs to be reshaped or reformed in order to deal with the challenge of this modernity. And you get this sort of account in other places as well. So African and or scholars writing on Africa or South Asia who describe the ways in which anti-colonial nationalisms feel compelled to downplay androgynous dimensions of their cultures and to emphasize or to construct these virile, potent, masculinized nationalisms that they feel would be better able to deal with the challenge of colonial modernity. So in many places and times around this moment, you begin to see these articulations of homophobia that might not have made sense in previous historical moments. What interests me about Uganda is that we have an opportunity here to look at this institutionalization of homophobia unfolding in the present, but also in a historical sense, and I'm trying to do both of those things. And in the Ugandan case, two encounters in particular seem very interesting to me. One is, and this has been talked about quite a lot, the encounter between Ugandan politicians and clergy on the one hand, and US-based Christian evangelicals on the other hand. So various people have written about this. Jeff Charlette has written a book on the Christian fellowship called The Family, which involves born-again Christians in Uganda and the United States. Kapia Kaoma, a Zambian priest, has written an extraordinary, two reports actually, that details in almost forensic detail what the nature of these relationships are. And broadly, the story there is that as Christians, and really here I'm talking about Anglican Protestantism, but as evangelicals begin to feel that they are losing the culture wars on their home turf in countries like the United States, on issues such as the ordination of women as bishops or the blessing of same-sex unions and so forth, they are beginning to try to forge alliances with what they think to be the more conservative parts of their denominations in other parts of the world. So congregations in Africa, in Nigeria, Kenya, Rwanda, and so forth, and Uganda, so that in global norm-setting fora, such as the Lambeth Conference, which meets every 10 years, it's a kind of a global parliament for Anglicanism, if you like, they can wield a demographic majority as a result of having expanded, if you like, the terrain of their struggle. So what conservatives are doing is they're reshaping the geography on which their struggle is being fought. Knowing fully well that they lose on the smaller terrain, they expand the terrain of struggle to make it a worldwide one, so that in these global norm-setting fora, they can block progressive moves towards the ordination of women or the blessing of same-sex unions or whatever other wedge issues define the culture wars in that particular moment. And this is a really interesting phenomenon. One of the best books I've read about this is Miranda Hassett's book on the Anglican Communion, which is called Anglican Communion in Crisis. Particularly relevant, I think, as a way of understanding things like the vote on women bishops this week, about which I can say a little bit more later on. One of the really interesting, it's a wonderful ethnography of what is going on in these global conversations. And she looks very closely at churches in the United States and churches in Uganda. And one really interesting phenomenon that she talks about is the way in which conservatives who are dissatisfied with the liberal drift of their bishops in the United States are seceding from those bishops and placing themselves under what they call the temporary spiritual oversight of bishops in Nigeria, Kenya, Rwanda, and Uganda. It's an absolutely unprecedented move because it's very hard to think of any other realm of political, religious, or any other life in which a US authority willingly places itself under the jurisdiction of an African authority. And if you look at the kinds of discourses in these congregations, you hear people saying things like, and these are quotes in her book, America is sick and America needs intervention from Africa in order to save it from the spiritual and moral degradation into which it has sunk. It's a complete reversal of the usual tropes of American exceptionalism, America being the shining city on the hill, etc. And it's articulated by white Southern Republican Party voting people, not liberals. And in fact, the other interesting reversal is that these conservatives accuse liberals in the Anglican Communion of racism because they are seen to have somehow written off these parts of the global Anglican Communion as irredeemably backward on precisely these issues. So it's a real messing up of the geography and the geometry of liberal radical politics that we're sort of accustomed to. Now, the way in which that encounter is usually understood is a kind of straightforward exchange where the Americans give the Africans money and the Africans give the Americans votes. And this is quite a materialist way of understanding what's going on. It's also somewhat troubling because it sees the African actors in these transactions and relationships as easy to buy off, moved purely by money, not quite having ideas and beliefs of their own, and as being manipulated by external actors, which I'm not sure is exactly the right way, or I'm not sure that these relationships and transactions can be reduced to that sort of relationship. Just one other thing that I want to say about this before I move on to the second encounter, which is what I have a little bit more to say about, is that while it can look like conservatism and liberalism have switched places in these relationships, the view that these American churches have of African Christianity is itself quite an Orientalist one, except it's the noble savage version of Orientalism. One in which African Christianity is perceived to be more zealous, more spiritual, somehow closer to the source, but almost precisely because Africans are seen as less reflective, more literalist, more primitive in a sense. So it's a noble savage version of Orientalism that underpins this kind of conservative alliance with Americans, of course, with African congregations. Of course, that's just an interpretation, and I would imagine that if this were put to the people involved in these transactions, they would deny them. But I think that's something worth exploring in discursive analyses of these relationships. Okay, so that's the contemporary encounter that seems to underpin some of this politics. And in the context of the Ugandan bill, it's, the evidence that's adduced for this is that before the bill was actually drafted, American evangelicals traveling to Uganda hold a seminar attended by politicians and clergy at which they expound at length on the dangers to the family posed by sexual minority advocates and so forth. Okay, on to the other encounter, about which much less has been said, and maybe partly because people are still wondering about the relevance of this to anything that's happening now. And this is the 19th century encounter between British colonial missionaries and the Kingdom of Buganda, which is the largest constituent kingdom of the country that we now call Uganda. Now, the story here is an interesting one, and one that is incredibly well remembered in Uganda today, which is what interests me. And it goes something like this. The last pre-colonial ruler of Buganda, the Kabaka, the king, Mwanga, is believed, and belief is the key word here, is believed to have had what may have been sex, but we're not even sure that it was sex. So let's just bracket that as well. Is believed to have had, and Neville Hoard, who's written about this, hesitates even to use the word sex. He says corporeal intimacy with men in his court. When the first Christian missionaries, the CMS missionaries arrived in Buganda in 1879, the Roman Catholics 2 years later, 1877, and the Catholics 2 years later in 1879, converted these men in the court to Christianity, to their respective denominations, and taught them that these sorts of behaviors were a sin. The men in the court began refusing the king these favors or advances. The king sees this as a sign of political disloyalty and orders these men to be executed. The numbers of people executed are somewhere between, we know for sure that at least 45, but the estimates go into the low hundreds. The Catholic Church almost immediately begins a campaign to have these men canonized, which is an incredibly long process that takes about 80 years, until in 1964, 22 of these men are in fact canonized by the Catholic Church, so that they now become Catholic saints. They're very well-known saints. They're global Catholic icons. There is a shrine to them outside Kampala. There's a feast on the 3rd of June, which is celebrated every year. And this is a national public holiday. So the events of 1886 to 88, which is when this happened, are incredibly well remembered. And this is what interests me about the use of history in the Ugandan context. Because unlike attempts to resurrect, write, rewrite same-sex revisionist histories in other places, a lot of that effort has been about excavating, about reminding people about something that has been forgotten or lies buried. It's about constructing new histories of communities that bring in the same-sex characters. This is not really what one might need to do in Uganda because the story is incredibly well remembered. I think it's important to make a distinction here between history and memory. I'm almost more interested in what people think happened than in what happened. More interested in memory than in history. In part because all of the sources are colonial sources kept by missionaries, colonial officials, anthropologists, which of course have their own biases, inclusions and exclusions. But in part also because of a sense that what people think happened is politically much more consequential than what may or may not have happened. So I'm really interested in memory, and my way of thinking about memory has been to try and do a sort of ethnography of the pilgrimage site and the events that surround the festival and the remembering of these events every year on the 3rd of June. And I'll take you through some of what I did using the quite bad photographs. But basically it involved camping at the pilgrimage site for a number of weeks, talking to pilgrims, priests, theology students, people selling trinkets at the site, and just anybody I met in Uganda, in Kampala, because the story is incredibly well known. Every child in every school has learnt it in history or religious classes. Everybody knows what the day is about. There are hagiographies being sold, many different versions. There are film and theater narratives. People are named after the Ugandan martyrs, schools, hospitals, roads, it's everywhere. So it's, and the question I was asking people was quite simply, why did the king kill the pages? What is the story? What happened here? What do you think happened here? Why does this place have any significance for you? And why do you come here every year? So I didn't ask questions about sexuality. Now, sometimes the conversation became one about what the king had done and why he had done it, and sexuality did come into it. At other times, it didn't at all. So I sort of let the conversation go wherever people wanted to take it. And I got many different kinds of responses. But before I say anything about the responses, let me just show you some of the pictures so that you get a sense of what the, the practices and performances of religiosity and remembering that surround this site and the event. This is the Anglican Shrine. There are two shrines, the Anglican and the Catholic. The Catholic shrine is much bigger, but it's almost less revered because only one of the martyrs was killed there. All the other martyrs were killed at the Anglican Shrine, which is smaller, has much less by way of memorialization, but is visited by both Anglicans and Catholics because it's the site where the executions are believed to have taken place. So this is the new church on the site of the Anglican Shrine. This is a model of the martyrs being burnt. This is how it's imagined that they would have been burnt. And there are theology students doing guided tours. The pilgrims mill around and ask questions, and there's lots of, as you can see, tablets and signs. This is a small church, the altar that's been built on the site of the place where the remains of the martyrs are thought to be buried. This is a mural in there's also a seminary in a theological college on the site of the Anglican Shrine, and a mural that depicts the events that I've just been describing very briefly. It's a really interesting mural because you can see here the coming of white men to the kingdom of Buganda, the first missionaries, the first conversions. You can see the first black missionaries, the first black catechists preaching to the early native converts, and then the events of the executions and the burning themselves, the burning itself. And then in the second half of the mural, you suddenly see all the good work that the church has done. And I find this abruptness in the mural also very interesting. In India, it's famously said that in secondary school history textbooks, history stops in 1947 and then civics begins. So you start learning your duties to the new post-colonial nation state, and there's no sense of history and politics after that. And this mural is a bit like that. You get the very incredibly political story of the advent of Christianity, and then the martyrdoms happen, and there's this frequent slogan that I kept hearing in a lot of the interviews: the blood of the martyrs is the seed of our church. And that's an enduring trope in a lot of Catholic discourse, not just in Uganda. But you can see this: the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church, and then suddenly you have this church that does all these incredibly good things and is now apolitical, which of course is not true because it continues to be a deeply political institution. This is the Catholic site, and this is a model of one of the pages praying to or receiving the sacrament from one of the Catholic priests. Some of the books that were on sale. There were lots of stalls, very festive atmosphere around the Basilica, which I'll show you shortly. And these are some of the books that were being sold. This was, these were, what are they called? I'll show you. These are sort of pieces of cloth that are worn by women. They're sold in different sizes. So some of them are the sizes of tea towels, and others are big enough to actually wear around you. And as you can see, they refer to it as the Namugongo is the place, and the events are referred to as the Holocaust, which take place on Ascension Day. These are pilgrims praying around the stump of a tree where one of the martyrs was killed. You can see people praying, but you can also see people taking photographs and watching people praying. So there's often quite a lot of press and media coverage as well. Here's a woman wearing one of those, people praying. This is at the center of the Catholic shrine. There is a man-made lake and a big altar, and this sort of island in the middle of the lake is very significant because it's where the Pope visited in 1969 and held Mass. And so every time you ask somebody about this little island, they will tell you that the Pope visited, and that was an incredibly important moment. This is the inside of the Catholic Basilica. The photographs aren't great, but you can get a sense of, it's quite an immense structure, and I'll show you the outside shortly. And it has 22 spokes, or sort of radii, or radial sort of things. I have no architectural vocabulary, but you'll see when you look at the outside, each of which represents one of the Catholic martyrs. So you can see each of these spokes. The entire structure is sort of meant to be a stylized African hut, very modernist, obviously, but an interpretation of an African hut, with each of these representing one of the 22 martyrs. And as you know, as I said, very festive atmosphere, lots of singing, dancing. This is interesting. This is the Anglican Shrine, and it's a well where the executioners are believed to have washed their implements after they killed the martyrs. So the pilgrims come and collect that water and drink it. It's thought to be holy water because the blood of the martyrs was washed in it. There was a great brass band playing. This was the Anglican Service, which took place in this great outdoor valley, thousands of people. It was the most immense service I'd ever attended, just in terms of space and out in the open. This is a shrine, so there are individual shrines dedicated to each of the martyrs at many of the stations of their journey on the way to execution. So a lot of these martyrdom narratives imitate Christ's own journey towards crucifixion. So there are stages along the way. A lot of the hagiographies describe the martyrdoms in the most excruciating physical detail, how each martyr was tortured and for what, and you know which particular vendettas were sort of enacted around their killing. So this is a saint called Matia Mulumba, quite central Kampala, and the shrine that's dedicated to him. This is all at that shrine. This is back at the Catholic. And then in the Basilica, there are these incredibly beautiful stained glass windows, each of which is dedicated to one of the saints. And this was really interesting. This is an incredibly snarky poster in the Catholic Basilica, which basically disses the entire history of Protestantism. because as you can see a little later on, the explanation of who Protestants are, which means literally those who protest. They started with Martin Luther in 1518, and from protest comes protest without end. And if you look at the post as a whole, this is Catholicism, and this is Protestantism and what it has done. So I thought that was interesting as an indication of how rivalrous relationships between the different denominations still are, even though there is this broad convergence around the events of the martyrdoms, which are a foundational story for the Ugandan church as a whole. So you can see that the founding of the Ugandan church is somehow wrapped up in the denial of a same-sex narrative, or in the acknowledgement, actually, of a same-sex narrative, ironically. So on to what kinds of responses I got from people. And I won't go on for much longer, but I just want to, I'm still sort of processing interviews and things like that, but I can see already from what I've got that I seem to get 4 kinds of responses from people when I ask them why the king gave the order to kill the pages. The first kind of response told me a story that was almost entirely devoid of sexual content. And this story said something like this. The king heard the pages say the Lord's Prayer. He heard them say things like, "Thy will be done, thy kingdom come." He heard them pray to the King of Kings. And he interpreted Jesus Christ as a rival king, as a rival political authority who was now claiming the allegiance of his own courtiers. And so he ordered them to be executed in punishment for what he saw as an act of political rebellion. In this kind of narrative, although people seemed to contextualize what the king had done as something credible, believable, and rational, even if they disagreed with him. So in this sort of secular political understanding of what had happened, what the king did made complete sense, even to believing Christians. In fact, some said, we disagree with what he did, but if we were him, we too would have done the same thing. It was a very rationalist explanation for what the king had done and why, and quite devoid of any kind of sexual content. I got this from, particularly from people who were not very familiar with written sources. And I can say a little bit more about who they were. So that was one kind of response. The second kind of response, which I got mostly from people who were quite familiar with written sources and had actually read a lot of the theological and historical accounts, these were mostly priests. And it's interesting to me that priests were most willing to say this. Said, yes, the king had sex with men in the court, but this was completely against the culture of Buganda at the time, and he learnt it from the Arabs who were in the court. That's really interesting because it's a strategy of displacement which mirrors the contemporary displacement onto the West, but is a strategy of displacement nonetheless. And so I've become interested in historicizing where this strategy of displacement might come from. About the time that all of this was happening in Buganda, Richard Burton, the famous Victorian explorer, had translated I think he had translated the Arabian Nights by this point and written the terminal essay to the last volume of the Arabian Nights, in which he performs this sort of mapping exercise of sexual behavior in the world. And he describes what he calls the Satanic Zone, a zone in which sodomy is endemic, and which he maps, and we're back to place now, which he maps as sort of focused around the Mediterranean, running in a broad swathe across the world through North Africa, the Middle East, the west and the northern part of India, into China and Japan. The Satanic Zone, interestingly, excludes sub-Saharan Africa. Now, Burton had visited Uganda and East Africa. He is credited with discovering the source of the Nile in the way that white people often discover things in other parts of the world. And so he was very familiar with the place, and he traveled extensively in other parts of sub-Saharan Africa as well. So it's interesting that sub-Saharan Africa is somehow excluded from the Satanic Zone. And this, it turns out, is a recurring trope of the way Europeans were writing about, anthropologists were writing about same-sex behavior in other parts of the world. There is this sort of association of same-sex behavior with the Arab and a disassociation from sub-Saharan Africans. And that raises lots of questions about why this might be the case. Rudy Blaze, in a book called The Geography of Perversion, suggests, and it's no more than a speculation, but one of the things he speculates about is that precisely because Africans were being used as slave labor, the kinds of tropes that were constructed around them were those of virile masculinity. So that these tropes become sort of the cultural superstructure of a slave labor economy, or a global distribution of labor in which black bodies are meant to labor and therefore are imagined and constructed as these hypermasculine beings, rather than given to practices like same-sex behavior and sodomy and so forth. The other trope that's really interesting is the association of sodomy with advanced and degenerating civilizations. So ancient Rome and Greece, precisely because they were so advanced, became decadent and began to indulge in these kinds of practices. Whereas sub-Saharan Africa, precisely because it is seen as primitive, is seen as having a sexuality that is close to nature and of nature, and not of this advanced, degenerative, hyper-civilized kind. So those are two of the ideas that, two of the sort of accounts that seem to circulate in this literature that might explain the geography of perversion, as Blaze calls it. So that's, it may be the case that this idea that priests in Uganda were telling me itself comes out of some of these colonial sources and colonial anthropology. The third kind of story I got was, none of this ever happened, and this was a smear campaign that the missionaries cooked up in order to make the king look bad, in order to discredit him. The white colonial missionaries accused him of sodomy so that they could then push him out of power and welcome the British state in to establish a protectorate in East Africa. And I got this kind of explanation from all sorts of people, from a historian, from an atheist journalist who had, and interestingly from both people who were opposed to homosexuality and sexual minority activism, as well as people who were often quite supportive of it. So this kind of explanation didn't map neatly at all onto the pro and the anti-homosexuality camps. It simply seemed to come from a kind of post-colonial skepticism of any colonial sources. And because the only sources for these events are colonial and are colonial missionaries and anthropologists, they were seen as suspect and as a kind of smear campaign against the king. The fourth kind of narrative, which I was really, this is where I began. I was interested in thinking about how activists might use this history and whether they might use the history at all. And when I first went to Uganda about 2 years ago, I found that activists didn't really want to touch the story, or didn't sort of mentioned it in passing. Mwanga was, and sometimes in a slightly ahistorical way, Mwanga was gay, therefore this has been around in our culture forever, but didn't make a big deal of it. And that was interesting to me, why this wasn't used more. Because in India, there had been an enormous investment in producing work that sort of told these same-sex histories, mined literary and historical archives, and tried to read things against the grain and so forth. And this was seen to be enormously important. And that didn't seem to happen as much in Uganda, in part because of the problem of written sources and the difference between written and oral cultures, but also where there were written sources and where there were events that were this well remembered. I found that the non-use of the story somewhat puzzling. And I got many different accounts. The obvious account is, in the way that the story is remembered, Mwanga is the villain and the pages are the hero. So it's very hard to use, to put it crudely, even though there are actually more complex, nuanced rememberings of Mwanga, as I discovered. So it's hard to use him as a normative model of sexuality, of how to be, given that he is the character that is demonized. You need a reversal of the moral codings of the characters in order to hold his behavior up as evidence of what is normative. Interestingly, in some interviews, I asked people whether there were other renderings of the story, and some people said, yes, there are people who remember Mwanga as the hero. And I said, well, that's puzzling, because then you remember both Mwanga and the pages. You celebrate both sides of this transaction in which one killed the other. And this journalist said, yes, of course. In our history books, we celebrate Mwanga. In our religious books, we celebrate the pages. And I thought that was interesting as well, that there was this celebration of Mwanga as an anti-colonial hero at the same time as there was this demonization of him on religious grounds. This sort of leads off into another little bit of the project where the telling of the story itself changes over time, the hegemonic telling. So in the early years of post-colonial independence, Mwanga is hailed as a hero in some sources. When Idi Amin takes over in the 1970s and assassinates the Anglican archbishop, kills the it's believed that he gives the order to kill the Anglican archbishop. This happens almost exactly 100 years after Mwanga gives an order to kill a Protestant CMS bishop. And so in that moment, Idi Amin is analogized to Mwanga. And that is the moment in the 70s when Mwanga begins to be demonized and seen as the villain. So another dimension of the story is trying to trace how the telling of the story has changed over time. The earlier four narratives are a snapshot of today. They don't really tell us how the story has changed over the long durée of Ugandan history. So that is something that I want to think about as well. I don't want to go on for much longer. I think maybe I'll just wrap up by saying that this is a work in progress, as you can see, and I'm still trying to make sense of what this might tell us about the geography of how we understand the institutionalization of homophobia, which is one of the questions I began with. If we start thinking in terms of encounters and the relationships between places, it becomes much harder to resort to the absolutist geography of homo-nationalist narratives or of the kind of simplistic activist versus state narratives that I opened with. I remain sort of uncertain about the activist potential in this history in the current context in Uganda, but it's something that I'm in discussion with activists about. Yeah, I think I'm going to stop there without wrapping it up too much because there are lots of loose ends that I haven't tied up yet. So rather than kind of foist a false coherence on material that's flying off in different directions, I'd much rather just leave this open to questions and comments. Thanks.